to go! I got nowhere else to go. I got nothing else.
I still remember the first time I saw him cry on screen. Not the gentle tears of romance, but the desperate, hollow weeping of a man who had lost everything that mattered. It wasn't acting, it was recognition. The recognition of someone who understood that particular kind of emptiness from the inside out. This is Richard Gere, the silver screen's most enigmatic leading man. The face that launched 1,000 dreams and just as many heartbreaks. For decades he was Hollywood's definition of masculine elegance. The man who could make silence speak louder than words, whose very presence could transform an ordinary scene into cinema poetry. But behind that perfect facade lay a story Hollywood never wanted you to know. A story of a man trapped by his own beauty, haunted by choices that would cost him everything, and forever searching for something that fame could never provide. They called him difficult. They called him ungrateful. They banned him, blacklisted him, and tried to erase him from the very industry he had helped define. But what if the real tragedy wasn't what Hollywood did to Richard Gere? What if it was what Richard Gere did to himself? This is the tragic life of Richard Gere. A man who spent 5 decades learning that sometimes the most beautiful prisons are the ones we build with our own hands. Richard Tiffany Gere entered the world on August 31, 1949, in Philadelphia. From the very beginning, he was different. Not just handsome, though that would come, but possessed of an almost unsettling intensity that made adults uncomfortable and other children wary. His father Homer sold insurance with the steady determination of a man who believed in the American dream. His mother Doris kept house with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned early that dreams were luxuries few could afford. They were good people, solid people, the kind who believed that hard work and moral character would always be enough. But Richard was never enough for them, not in the way they had hoped. The family moved to Syracuse when Richard was still young, settling into the kind of middle-class respectability that defined 1950s America. Homer wanted his son to be practical, grounded, someone who would build a sensible life on sensible foundations. Instead, he got a boy who disappeared for hours into music, who composed melodies that seemed to come from some unreachable place inside him. By high school, Richard had become the boy everyone noticed but no one quite understood. He played instruments, piano, guitar, trumpet, with the kind of natural ability that frustrated his teachers because he refused to be molded by their methods. He excelled in gymnastics, his body moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. He was student council president, the kind of leader others followed without quite knowing why. But there was something hollow about it all. Even then, friends would later recall, Richard seemed to be performing his own life rather than living it. He was the perfect student, the perfect son, the perfect young man, and he hated every moment of it. The first crack in the facade came during his senior year. While other boys planned for practical futures, Richard announced he wanted to study philosophy. Not business, not law, philosophy. The study of questions that had no answers, problems that had no solutions, truths that could never be proven. His father was devastated, his mother was bewildered. But Richard was already gone, disappeared into a world of abstract thought and impossible dreams, searching for something he couldn't name but desperately needed to find. He enrolled at the University of Massachusetts in 1967, just as the world was exploding around him. Vietnam raged, students protested. The Cultural Revolution swept across America like a fever, and Richard found himself caught between the life he was supposed to want and the life he actually craved. For 2 years he tried to be the student his parents expected. He attended classes, wrote papers, participated in discussions. But all the time, something was eating away at him from the inside. A restlessness. A sense that every day he spent in lecture halls was another day stolen from his real life, whatever that might be. In 1969, he dropped out. Not because he was failing, but because he was succeeding at something that felt like slow suicide. The disappointment in his parents' eyes would haunt him for decades. But the alternative, continuing to live a lie, felt like something worse than disappointment. It felt like death. Years later, in rare moments of vulnerability, Richard would describe those early years as his first experience with what he would come to understand as the central tragedy of his life. The discovery that the person the world wanted him to be and the person he actually was were separated by a chasm so wide that no amount of success could bridge it. He was 20 years old, college dropout, with no clear plan and no clear future. But for the first time in his life, he was free. And that freedom, intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, would shape everything that followed. London, 1973, A 24-year-old American with borrowed money and impossible dreams stands outside the theater district, staring at the posters that promise glamour and transformation. Richard Gere had come to England to escape himself, but instead he would learn the most crucial skill of his life, how to become someone else so completely that the original person disappeared. His first major role was Danny Zuko in the London production of Grease. On paper it seemed perfect, the leading man role in a hit musical, the chance to showcase his singing voice and natural charisma. But for Richard it became something else entirely. It became his first lesson in the price of being desired for the wrong reasons. Night after night, he would stand on stage and watch the audience's faces. The women weren't looking at Danny Zuko. They were looking at Richard Gere, or rather at some idealized version of him that existed only in their imaginations. They saw the leather jacket, the perfect hair, the practiced smile, and they projected their own fantasies onto him like he was a screen rather than a person. The applause felt hollow. The attention felt suffocating. Here he was, finally successful, finally the star he had dreamed of becoming, and all he could think about was escape. Between Grease and his next role in Taming of the Shrew, Richard began a habit that would define the rest of his career. He started saying no, not to bad roles or bad money, but to the easy path, the obvious choice, the thing that would make everyone happy except himself. Then came Bent, and everything changed. Bent was a play about gay men in Nazi concentration camps. It was challenging, controversial, uncommercial. Everything that career advisors tell young actors to avoid. But something about the material spoke to Richard in a way that the crowd-pleasing roles never had. Here was a story about men who faced annihilation for the crime of being themselves, who found love and dignity in the most impossible circumstances. For the first time since dropping out of college, Richard felt like he was doing something that mattered. The audiences were smaller. The reviews were mixed, but the work felt real in a way that Grease never had. He was no longer performing himself. He was disappearing into something larger and more important. But the theater world is small, and word travels fast. Casting directors began to whisper about Richard Gere. Talented, certainly, but difficult. He turned down safe roles for risky ones. He asked too many questions about motivation and meaning. He seemed more interested in the art than the business, which in entertainment is often the same as being interested in failure. The whispering would follow him to Hollywood, where it would eventually crystallize into something far more damaging, the reputation of a man who couldn't be trusted to simply be what he appeared to be. But in those final months on the London stage, before the movie cameras and the magazine covers and the global fame, Richard Gere experienced something he would spend the rest of his career trying to recapture. The pure satisfaction of disappearing so completely into a role that for a few hours each night he no longer existed. It was the closest thing to peace he had ever known. And like everything else in his life that brought him peace, it wouldn't last. The phone call came on a Tuesday in 1977. Richard was in his cramped New York apartment, subsisting on whatever theater work he could find, when his agent delivered news that would change everything. Terrence Malick wanted him for Days of Heaven. Malick was already a legend, a director who painted with light and shadow, who could find poetry in the smallest gestures. For any actor, the call would have been a career-making moment. For Richard, it felt more like a sentencing. The role required almost no dialogue. Instead, Malick wanted Richard to communicate everything through presence, through the architecture of his face, through the language of longing that seemed to emanate from him naturally. It was acting as pure being, the kind of challenge that should have thrilled him. Instead, it terrified him. On set, watching the rushes, Richard saw what everyone else saw. A face so perfect it seemed computer-generated. A presence so magnetic it bent the light around it. But what he felt was something else entirely. The strange horror of watching himself become a thing rather than a person. A symbol rather than a human being. Days of Heaven made him a star, but it also trapped him in a cage made of his own beauty. Suddenly, every director wanted that face, that presence, that mysterious quality that seemed to promise everything and reveal nothing. They didn't want Richard Gere the actor, they wanted Richard Gere the image, the fantasy, the projection screen for other people's desires. American Gigolo came next, and with it, the role that would define and haunt him for the rest of his career. Julian Kay was everything the world thought Richard Gere was. Beautiful, desired, emotionally unavailable, and ultimately hollow. The performance was brilliant precisely because it wasn't much of a performance at all. Richard simply had to be himself, or rather the version of himself that everyone wanted to see. But the success felt like drowning. Suddenly he couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, couldn't have a conversation without being studied, couldn't exist without being consumed. The man who had spent his youth feeling invisible now found himself the most visible person in any room, and the visibility felt like violence. He began to withdraw. Not from work. The roles kept coming, and he kept accepting them, but from the world itself. He studied Buddhism, seeking something that fame couldn't touch. He traveled to Tibet, looking for a version of himself that existed outside of magazine covers and movie posters. He began to see celebrity, not as achievement, but as a kind of spiritual emergency, a test of whether he could remain human while the world insisted on treating him as a god. Then came Julia Roberts and Pretty Woman, and whatever remained of his private self was swept away forever. The chemistry was undeniable, the film was magic, the box office was stratospheric. But for Richard, the success felt like a funeral, the burial of whatever hope he might have had for an ordinary life, for relationships based on reality rather than projection, for a career based on craft rather than charisma. In interviews from that period, if you watch closely, you can see the exact moment when Richard Gere realizes that his greatest professional triumph has become his deepest personal tragedy. He has everything any actor could want, and it's killing him slowly, beautifully, and completely. The golden boy had built his own golden cage, and the key was melting in his hand. Love for Richard Gere was always a performance reviewed by millions. His early relationships existed in a strange purgatory between private reality and public consumption. Every dinner date became a photo opportunity. Every quiet moment was invaded by telephoto lenses and speculative headlines. The women in his life found themselves transformed overnight from individuals into supporting characters in the Richard Gere story, their own identities subsumed by their association with him. Penelope Milford understood this first and perhaps best. Their 7-year relationship, from 1971 to 1978, spanned Richard's transformation from struggling actor to emerging star. She watched him change, not because fame corrupted him, but because it demanded a version of himself that was incompatible with genuine intimacy. "You can't love someone who belongs to everyone," she would tell friends years later, in one of her rare comments about their relationship. And Richard always belonged to everyone, even before he was famous. He just couldn't help it. The pattern was established early. Richard would meet someone real, someone who saw past the surface, and for a brief moment he would believe that this time would be different. But the machinery of celebrity would inevitably intervene, transforming private individuals into public figures, intimate moments into magazine covers, love stories into marketing campaigns. Sylvia Martins, the Brazilian painter who shared nearly a decade of his life, perhaps came closest to breaking through. She was an artist in her own right, someone who understood the difference between the person and the persona. Together they traveled to Tibet, sat in meditation, explored the spiritual questions that had haunted Richard since college. For a while it seemed possible that he might find peace through connection, that love might be the antidote to the isolation of fame. But even Sylvia couldn't compete with the machinery of celebrity. The paparazzi that followed their every move. The constant speculation about marriage, children, breakups. The way their private moments became public property. The moment they stepped outside their door. "I loved Richard," she would say years later. "But I could never love being Richard Gere's girlfriend. It was too much for any real person to carry." The Barbra Streisand chapter reads like a collision between two different concepts of celebrity. She had learned to weaponize her fame, to use it as armor and sword. He had never learned to protect himself from it. Their brief affair was less a romance than a masterclass in the different ways that famous people can be destroyed by their own visibility. But it was the relationship with Cindy Crawford that would become Richard's most public education in the impossibility of love under surveillance. Here were two people at the absolute peak of their respective industries. Hollywood's leading man and fashion's biggest star, attempting something as fragile and private as love in the most public circumstances imaginable. The speculation began immediately. Was it real or publicity? Were they happy or performing happiness? Was Richard using Cindy to deflect persistent rumors about his sexuality? Or was Cindy using Richard to transition from model to serious cultural figure? The questions multiplied like viruses, infecting every private moment with public doubt. The infamous Times of London advertisement, $30,000 spent to deny rumors and affirm their commitment, stands as perhaps the most heartbreaking document in celebrity history. Here were two people so desperate to protect their private reality from public fiction that they paid to publish their love like a press release. But the gesture backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing speculation, it amplified it. Instead of protecting their relationship, it turned it into a meta-commentary on the relationship between celebrity and authenticity. They weren't just Richard and Cindy anymore. They were the couple who had to buy newspaper ads to prove they were real. The marriage lasted 4 years, but in many ways it was over the moment they felt compelled to defend it publicly. You cannot litigate love, you cannot argue intimacy into existence, and you certainly cannot purchase authenticity, no matter how much you spend. After the divorce, Richard would describe the experience as educational. I learned that there are some things so precious they die the moment you try to prove they exist. March 30th, 1993. The Academy Awards. Richard Gere walked onto the stage to present the award for Best Art Direction, but what he delivered instead was a moment that would define the rest of his career and cost him nearly everything he had spent decades building. Standing before 1 billion viewers worldwide, he deviated from the script. In the name of the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Tibet, I would like to dedicate this evening to all those who have suffered under Chinese rule. May they have the strength to find their way home. 30 seconds. That's all it took to end the golden age of Richard Gere's Hollywood career. The audience sat in stunned silence. Producers panicked. Network executives scrambled. Within hours, the machinery of damage control was in full motion, but the damage was already done. Richard Gere had committed the cardinal sin of Hollywood. He had used his platform for something other than entertainment. The phone calls started immediately. Not congratulations for taking a stand, but recriminations for breaking the unwritten rules. In Hollywood, stars are supposed to be beautiful, charming, and politically neutered. They can have opinions, but only safe ones. They can support causes, but only profitable ones. They can speak truth, but only truth that doesn't threaten anyone's bottom line. Richard had violated all of these rules simultaneously. The ban from the Academy Awards was swift and absolute. For 20 years, one of Hollywood's biggest stars was prohibited from attending, presenting, or even being nominated for the industry's most prestigious honor. It was unprecedented, petty, and brutally effective. But the real punishment wasn't the Oscar ban. It was the quiet blacklisting that followed. Phone calls stopped being returned. Scripts stopped arriving. Meetings were mysteriously canceled. Richard Gere, one of the most bankable stars of the previous 2 decades, suddenly found himself persona non grata in the town that had made him famous. The reason was simple. China had become Hollywood's most important international market, and the Chinese government had made it clear that any studio working with Richard Gere would find their films banned in China. In the calculus of global entertainment, one actor's conscience wasn't worth $1 billion market. I knew exactly what I was doing, Richard would say years later. I knew it would cost me, but some things matter more than career. The tragedy wasn't just professional. It was personal. Richard had spent years struggling with the emptiness of fame, searching for meaning in a life that seemed to exist only on surfaces. When he finally found a cause that gave his life purpose, speaking out for the oppressed people of Tibet, the very industry that had created him turned its back on him. The man who had spent decades feeling trapped by his success now found himself liberated by his failure. But liberation came at a price that few people could afford to pay: the loss of the only life he had ever known how to live. April 15th, 2007. New Delhi. What should have been a routine appearance at an HIV/AIDS awareness event became another chapter in Richard Gere's ongoing education in the ways that celebrity can transform innocence into scandal. The event was important to him. HIV/AIDS advocacy had become one of his primary humanitarian focuses, and India was a crucial front in the global fight against the disease. He came with genuine purpose, real commitment, and the best intentions. What he didn't account for was how those intentions would translate across cultural boundaries. On stage with Bollywood actress Shilpa Shetty, Richard did what came naturally to him as a Hollywood veteran. He embraced her and kissed her cheek in what he understood as a standard gesture of affection and respect. In the context of American entertainment culture, it was routine, meaningless, the kind of casual intimacy that happens hundreds of times at any industry event. But this wasn't America, and the gesture wasn't received as routine. Within hours, the images were everywhere, not just in Indian media but global media, transformed from a moment of awkward cultural miscommunication into an international incident. Conservative groups across India erupted in outrage. Protests filled the streets. Effigies were burned. Death threats poured in. A warrant was issued for Richard's arrest on charges of public obscenity. The man who had already been banned from the Oscars and blacklisted by major studios now found himself literally criminalized for a gesture of friendship. It was absurd, disproportionate, and utterly heartbreaking. Not just for Richard, but for Shilpa Shetty, who found herself dragged into a controversy that had nothing to do with anything she had done. The legal charges were eventually dropped. The Indian Supreme Court would rule them baseless 8 months later. But the damage was done. Richard Gere had been transformed from humanitarian advocate into cultural villain, from someone trying to help into someone who needed to be stopped. In quieter moments, Richard would reflect on the incident with characteristic thoughtfulness. I learned that good intentions are never enough. I learned that being American in the world means carrying the weight of assumptions I never made and privileges I never asked for. I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is innocent. But perhaps most tragically, He learned that even his humanitarian work, the thing that had given his life meaning after Hollywood abandoned him, could be weaponized against him, transformed from compassion into controversy by forces beyond his control. The man who had lost his career for speaking truth about Tibet now lost his ability to advocate effectively for HIV/AIDS prevention in one of the world's most critical regions. Good intentions, it turned out, were not just insufficient, they could be actively dangerous. After the India incident, something fundamental shifted in Richard Gere's relationship with public life. The man who had spent decades learning to live under surveillance suddenly found himself living in a different kind of exile, not from geography, but from relevance. The phone stopped ringing. Not completely. There were still independent films, still smaller projects, still directors who valued craft over commerce, but the machinery of major studio filmmaking had moved on without him. Richard Gere, who had once been mentioned in the same breath as Robert Redford and Paul Newman, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to stars who confused their platform with their purpose. The silence was deafening, and, in some ways, liberating. For the first time since American Gigolo, Richard could move through the world without being constantly watched, analyzed, consumed. He could have conversations that weren't interviews. He could make mistakes that weren't front-page news. He could exist as a person rather than as a symbol. But the transition was brutal. Imagine spending 30 years as one of the most famous faces on Earth, then suddenly finding yourself invisible. Imagine having your phone calls returned instantly for decades, then discovering that you have to wait like everyone else. Imagine being someone whose mere presence could change the energy of any room, then realizing that you've become just another aging actor in a town full of them. The independent films that came his way, Time Out of Mind, The Dinner, Norman, were often brilliant, but they played in art house theaters to audiences who could be counted in hundreds rather than millions. The man who had once opened movies worldwide now found himself grateful for limited releases and festival screenings. But perhaps more devastating than professional irrelevance was personal invisibility. The dating became different, not easier, despite what one might expect, but more complicated. How do you explain to someone that you used to be famous? How do you navigate relationships when your lack of current relevance is somehow more defining than your past success? The loneliness during this period was profound. Not the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only want something from you, but the deeper loneliness of being forgotten by a world that once couldn't get enough of you. Richard filled the empty spaces with meditation, with humanitarian work that received no press coverage, with long walks in Pound Ridge where no one recognized him, or if they did, no longer cared. He read extensively, philosophy, Buddhism, literature that helped him understand his experience not as unique tragedy but as universal human condition. Everyone gets forgotten eventually, he would reflect years later. The only question is whether you remember yourself. But the real tragedy of the wilderness years wasn't professional or even personal. It was spiritual. Richard had spent decades searching for meaning beyond fame. But when fame disappeared, he discovered that the search itself had been compromised by its context. How do you find authentic purpose when your entire adult life has been lived in the artificial environment of celebrity? The answer, it turned out, would come not from within, but from an unexpected source, a woman who had never seen Pretty Woman and didn't care that she was supposed to be impressed. Positano, Italy, 2014. The Hotel Cyrenus overlooks the Mediterranean like a fairy tale, all terraced gardens and impossible blue views. Richard Gere, now 65 and carrying the weight of professional exile and personal disappointment, had come here seeking nothing more than quiet and solitude. What he found instead was Alejandra Silva. She was 31, Spanish, recently divorced, and managing her family's hotel with the kind of competent elegance that comes from dealing with celebrities so routinely that they cease to be impressive. When Richard introduced himself, she looked at him with polite recognition but no particular excitement. She had seen movie stars before. They were guests, not gods. For the first time in decades, Richard found himself in the presence of a woman who was not performing for him, not trying to impress him, not calculating what his attention might be worth. Alejandra was simply herself, direct, intelligent, completely unintimidated by his reputation or his supposed charisma. The conversation that first evening lasted hours, covering everything from art to politics to the particular challenges of running a family business in modern Italy. What it didn't cover was his career, his past relationships, or any of the topics that had dominated his interactions with women for the previous 30 years. She talked to me like I was a person, Richard would later say, not like I was Richard Gere. I had forgotten what that felt like. But the path from that first conversation to lasting relationship was neither simple nor swift. Alejandra lived in Europe, Richard in America. She had a young son from her previous marriage, responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned for romantic adventure. She was also honest about her concerns, the 33-year age difference, the cultural gap, the reality that any relationship with him would inevitably become public property. What followed was perhaps the most genuine courtship of Richard's life. Unable to rely on his usual arsenal of celebrity perks and public attention, he had to win her over as himself. Not Richard Gere, the movie star, but Richard, the man who sent handwritten letters, who listened more than he spoke, who proved his interest through consistency rather than grand gestures. The letters arrived daily, written in Richard's careful handwriting, discussing books they'd both read, sharing thoughts about Buddhism and art, asking about her son and her work. They weren't love letters in the conventional sense. They were conversation letters, the written equivalent of those long talks they'd had in Positano. Slowly, carefully, something real began to build between them. Not the passionate intensity of his youth, but something more sustainable. Mutual respect, shared values, the recognition of two people who had both learned to value authenticity over excitement. When Alejandra finally agreed to move to New York in 2015, it wasn't because she had been swept away by Hollywood glamour. It was because she had found a partner who valued what she valued, who wanted what she wanted, who saw her as completely as she saw him. Their 2018 wedding was held at Richard's estate in Pound Ridge, conducted by Tibetan monks in a Buddhist ceremony that emphasized commitment over spectacle. Alejandra wore 2 dresses, both custom-designed, both elegant, neither attempting to compete with the fashion history of Richard's previous relationships. The tragedy of Richard Gere's romantic life had always been that love existed in the space between private reality and public consumption, that intimacy was impossible when every relationship became performance art. With Alejandra, he finally found someone strong enough to insist on privacy, grounded enough to resist the gravity of his fame, and complete enough in herself to love him without needing him to be anything other than who he was. But even this victory carried the weight of loss. Richard was now in his 70s, and the love he had finally found felt like compensation for all the love he had been unable to accept or provide when he was younger. The tragedy wasn't that he had found happiness, it was that it had taken him so long to become someone capable of receiving it. In the end, the tragedy of Richard Gere isn't what happened to him, it's what he had to give up to survive what happened to him. Consider the mathematics. 30 years as one of the world's most famous faces, followed by 20 years of gradual exile from the industry that made him. 50 years of adult life lived almost entirely under observation, where every choice was scrutinized, every relationship was analyzed, every mistake was amplified into scandal. The cost was measured not just in career opportunities lost, though those losses were substantial, but in human experiences foregone, the simple pleasure of being unknown in a crowd, the possibility of failure without consequence, the ability to love someone without that love becoming content for public consumption. But perhaps the deepest tragedy was temporal. By the time Richard had learned how to protect himself from the machinery of celebrity, he had lost decades to its operation. By the time he found genuine love, he was too old to build the family life he might have wanted in his 30s. By the time he understood the price of speaking truth, he had already paid it. The man who captivated millions on screen spent most of his life unable to captivate himself off screen. The actor who embodied romantic perfection spent decades unable to find sustainable romance. The star who seemed to have everything spent most of his career feeling like he had nothing that actually mattered. And yet, there is something magnificent about Richard Gere's refusal to accept the limitations that celebrity imposed on him. He could have stayed silent about Tibet and kept his career. He could have avoided controversial causes and maintained his bankability. He could have played the game that Hollywood wanted him to play, and retired wealthy, respected, and completely hollow. Instead, he chose to be human, in an industry that rewards people for being symbols. He chose to speak truth in a culture that values comfortable lies. He chose to age visibly in a business that worships eternal youth. He chose to marry for love, in a world that expected him to marry for image. The tragedy of Richard Gere is not that he failed, it's that he succeeded at the wrong things for the wrong reasons for far too long, and by the time he learned to succeed at the right things, much of his life had already been spent. But there is something beautiful about late-arriving wisdom, something hopeful about the possibility that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Richard Gere at 75 is not the man Richard Gere at 35 was supposed to become, but he might be the man Richard Gere at 20 was afraid he could never be, authentic, purposeful, at peace. Today, Richard Gere lives quietly in Madrid with Alejandra and their young sons, far from the machinery that once consumed him. He appears occasionally in small films, speaks selectively about causes that matter to him, and exists largely outside the cultural conversation that once couldn't function without him. It is, by the metrics of celebrity culture, a kind of failure. The man who was once mentioned alongside the greatest stars of his generation is now remembered primarily for what he walked away from rather than what he achieved. His name appears more often in retrospective articles about 1980s culture than in contemporary discussions of current cinema. But by different metrics, human metrics, it represents something like victory. Richard Gere has achieved what few celebrities ever manage, the transition from symbol back to person, from public property back to private individual, from performance back to authentic existence. The letters from Alejandra that he still writes by hand, the conversations with his young sons in Spanish and English, the quiet charitable work that receives no press coverage, the meditation practice that has deepened into genuine spiritual discipline. These are not the achievements that build Hollywood legacies, but they are the achievements that build meaningful lives. The tragedy is that it took so long. The triumph is that it happened at all. In his rare public appearances now, Richard Gere carries himself differently than he did during his peak fame years. The studied perfection has been replaced by something more interesting, earned wisdom, visible age, the kind of gravity that comes from having survived your own success. When asked about regrets, he is characteristically thoughtful. I regret the time I wasted trying to be who other people wanted me to be, but I don't regret learning, eventually, that the only person you can successfully be is yourself. The movies remain, of course. Pretty Woman still plays on television screens around the world. An Officer and a Gentleman still makes audiences cry. Chicago still showcases his surprising range. These artifacts of his peak years continue to provide pleasure to millions, regardless of the personal cost they exacted from their star. But perhaps Richard Gere's greatest performance has been his final act, the demonstration that it's possible to walk away from everything the world tells you matters, and discover that what actually matters has been waiting patiently for you to notice it all along. The tragedy of Richard Gere is not unique. It's the tragedy of anyone who spends too long living someone else's definition of success. But his resolution is rare, the courage to abandon that false success in favor of something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more real. He remains, even in retirement from relevance, exactly what he always was, a man too interesting for the world that made him famous, and finally wise enough to know the difference. The lights have dimmed now on the Richard Gere era of Hollywood glamour. The red carpets have moved on to younger faces. The magazine covers feature different dreams. The cultural conversation has found new obsessions. In the relentless forward motion of entertainment culture, yesterday's icons become today's curiosities with ruthless efficiency. But something remains. Not just the films, though those endure, but the questions that Richard Gere's life poses to anyone who cares to consider them seriously. What does it cost to be beautiful in a world that consumes beauty? How do you maintain authenticity when your entire existence becomes performance? Is it possible to be both famous and human, or must we ultimately choose between visibility and integrity? Richard Gere's life suggests that these questions have no easy answers, but they have honest ones. The cost of beauty in his case was nearly everything else. The maintenance of authenticity required the sacrifice of career security. The choice between fame and humanity was, ultimately, no choice at all, at least for someone who wanted to remain recognizable to himself. The man who once embodied every romantic fantasy now lives as a testament to the possibility that it's never too late to choose reality over image, substance over surface, love over attention. His tragedy was not that he was too beautiful or too famous or too desired. It was that these things prevented him for far too long from discovering who he actually was beneath all the projection and expectation. But his triumph, quiet, private, largely invisible to the culture that once couldn't look away, is that he finally made that discovery. Richard Gere at 75 knows something that Richard Gere at 35 could never have imagined, that the most beautiful performance is not performing at all, that the most magnetic presence is genuine absence of pretense, that the most romantic story is not the one written by others but the one you write yourself. The cameras have stopped rolling, but the man continues. And perhaps that is the most subversive act of all in a culture that insists on confusing the performance with the performer. Richard Gere survived. Richard Gere. In the end, that might be the greatest role he ever played. What do you remember about Richard Gere? Was it the movies,